Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. This is an event about credit reporting. So if that's not what you came here for, you should stay anyway, because it's going to be really interesting, I promise. Quick show of hands. Who has ever checked their credit report? Oh, that's a lot of you. Very good. Some of you look slightly confused, but I hope that after this, you will be very encouraged to check your credit report and take advantage of the fact that during COVID right now, you can check your credit report for free over and over again. Usually you can only do that for free once per year per credit reporting agency, the big three. And if you want to do that, annualcreditreport.com is where you should go. I don't mess with Credit Karma and all those other websites. Annualcreditreport.com is the actual government website. So that's just my little plug for checking your own credit reports and disputing any problems that you might have. And as you will learn today, there are many problems. So I don't know if I introduced myself, but I'm Eliza Dugan, and I am staff attorney at the Center for Consumer Law and Economic Justice here at our wonderful law school. And I'm going to now turn it over to Professor Glader, who will be our moderator today.
Thank you. Thank you. On Alcorn class, thank you guys for coming out. I'm told there is pizza, so please stick around. So the title of the presentation is Credit Reports, How Racial Bias, Gender Inequity, and Criminal Records Influence Where You Can Live, Work, and Borrow. And we're really in luck to talk about these topics today for two reasons. First, this is incredibly topical as we're seeing the effects of the global pandemic. Uh-oh, did I not do something?
No, you did not. I just realized this is covering.
I was afraid I broke the computer already. Okay.
You didn't even touch it.
That's what was particularly striking about it. We were doing a hypo about what I could do by just looking at things yesterday. So the topic of the discussion is incredibly timely, right? As we're seeing the effects of the global pandemic play out in disparate fashion, as so many people try to re-enter what we hear is a hot labor market and are subject to credit examination in the course of applying for a job. Others have suffered financial setbacks that will be reflected in credit reports, and that will make it more difficult to borrow to invest in the future. These effects will not be distributed, again, evenly along lines of race. So second reason is we have fantastic speakers to talk to us today about how credit reports are used, how they can be used against people, how they can be misused. I'm going to provide a very brief and completely inadequate introduction to each speaker. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm going to blame Professor Merman for telling me that the introductions had to be extremely terse because he's not here, so that's safe to do. In person with us today is Erika Heath, a lawyer at Francis Mailman's, is it Sumilis?
Sumilis.
Sumilis, thank you, here in San Francisco, where her practice focuses on individual and class action litigation on behalf of consumers hurt by erroneous credit reports, inaccurate background checks, unlawful debt collection practices, and other unfair trade practices. And previously, she worked as an attorney at the Atlanta Legal Aid Society, representing low-income consumers facing abusive business practices. And perhaps most importantly, she's teaching a class in the spring here at the law school. Joining us remotely is Chi-Chi Wu, a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, and a national expert on consumer credit issues, including fair credit reporting, credit cards, refund anticipation loans, and medical debt. Before joining NCLC, she worked in the Consumer Protection Division of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office and the Asian Outreach Unit of Greater Boston Legal Services. So we're really lucky to have these experts here with us today. They're going to speak first, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A before we break to allow you to get the food. So, Ms. Wu, thank you.
Thank you so much. So, so my name is Erika Heath. I am the consumer protection lawyer, focusing my practice largely on credit reporting issues, as was mentioned. One thing I like to start out with when I'm having a discussion about credit reports is I like to talk about how broad this particular industry and related industries and related products can be, because sometimes the scale of that can be really mind-blowing. I'm going to go back to the first question that was asked when we walked in here was how many people have checked their credit reports? And I saw a lot of hands go up. Now, of everybody who checked your credit reports, did anybody check any reports from an agency who wasn't one of the big three, who wasn't Experian, who wasn't TransUnion, who wasn't Equifax? Yes. I'm going to put you on the spot for just a second. Do you happen to remember what agency you checked? Okay, Credit Karma. Got it. And Credit Karma actually pulls from the big three typically. So you probably were looking at some form of your Equifax or Experian or TransUnion report, or maybe even all three. Sometimes they even merge them. But here's what's interesting. Oftentimes credit reporting and the laws around credit reporting are much broader than just credit reports. Credit reports are, as you've seen if you've checked it, sort of a report of how well you've been paying your debt. You know, are you paying your student loans on time? Are you paying your credit cards on time? And you get a detailed report of that. And sometimes there's a score attached to it to figure out, okay, how good is this person at paying off their debts? Now, there's a much broader category of reports, though, that are called consumer reports. And we're going to lump all of these agencies out there in this country. And I guarantee you 99% of them you've never even heard of. But they're collecting data about you and they're selling it to third parties when you are doing things like signing up for car insurance. There is an entire subset of consumer reporting agencies who are dedicated to gathering information about your driving habits and any kind of insurance claims that you may have had, so that when you go just try to sign up for car insurance, that insurance company can go back and pull a report to kind of see, well, how good of a risk is this person? That report that they get is a consumer report that's really kind of targeted towards you as a consumer of insurance products. Now, there are all kinds of things like that out there. And they cover, like, the kind of information that they cover is kind of extreme. As you can imagine with insurance, you can, there are reports out there that have your driving history, but there are also consumer reports out there that contain information about eviction histories, about past employment histories. A lot of these reports will contain criminal background histories. There are even some consumer reporting agencies out there who collect medical information. In fact, I don't know if anybody was with me last week in Ted's class, but we pulled up a number of websites of some of these consumer reporting agencies. One of them was rxhistories.com, and this is a company who actually collects prescription drug information on people for use in these reports. Oh, and then one of my favorite is even all the way down to retail returns. There's a company out there that collects information when you take a shirt back to the store to return it. There's a company that collects information about that to make sure that you're not engaging in retail exchange fraud. So the kinds of reports that are out there are kind of phenomenal and mind-blowing, sort of in kind of information that they collect and how often they actually are used. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Chi-Chi for a minute to talk about two of the probably most ubiquitous forms of consumer reporting, with tenant screening and employment reporting. So Chi-Chi.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Boston, Massachusetts. The internet's been a little glitchy on my end. I'm hoping it's not glitchy on your end. So if I freeze, it's not because I've totally blanked out and don't know what to say. Or maybe it is, and I'm just pretending. Anyways, my name's Chi-Chi Wu. I'm with the National Consumer Law Center. We're a policy and advocacy organization. We focus on low-income consumer issues. We are probably known for things like our 20-volume set of treatises on consumer law. We do a lot of work on Capitol Hill, state legislatures, and before federal agencies. I've been working on credit reporting issues and consumer reporting issues for close to 2 decades now. And sometimes it seems like things just the same old story or getting worse. So I'm going to actually go narrow in one respect, but broad in another. I am going to focus in the next few minutes on credit reports, which are the things you think about when you go to annualcreditreport.com, or if you're about to buy a car, open a credit card account. But I'm going to talk about how, in terms of the broadness, about how they're often used for other purposes that you might not think about. So one of them, as Erika mentioned, is employment. There are a number of employers who use credit reports when they're screening job applicants. It's not universal, but it's fairly often. It's actually 1 in 3 employers use it for some sort of position in their organization. Now they use the full credit report. They don't use a credit score. But still, you might think, what does your credit history have to do with your potential as a worker, or whether you'll be a good employee or commit fraud or do something wrong? And the answer so far, at least from the data and studies we've seen, is nothing. There's nothing that supports it. But unfortunately, a lot of employers do still use it. Another use of credit reports for non-credit purposes is tenant screening. And in fact, with tenant screening, not only do a lot of landlords use credit reports, it's probably over 90%. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Are folks here sort of familiar in general with the fact that we have an affordable housing crisis in the United States? And that there's an eviction crisis and a looming eviction wave from the pandemic? Well, credit checks make that situation even worse. What happens is tenants who are trying to find new housing because they've been displaced by something like the pandemic will often find that having impaired credit or having a low credit score is a barrier for them to get housing. Other uses we've seen, insurance. So there are these special insurance credit scores that they're not the same as your FICO score, but they are calculated based on your credit report. And the vast majority of car and home insurers use them, except in the states where it's prohibited. And that's not the whole universe of non-credit uses. A few years ago, how many of you are familiar with the public charge rule that the Trump administration put out that imposed all these new requirements on immigrants and would bar them if they use like Medicaid for their kids? Some of you heard about that? Okay, a couple of you. So that particular public charge rule also required the Department of Homeland Security to consider credit reports and credit scores in determining whether an immigrant would be a public charge. Fortunately, that rule has been stayed, and the Biden administration is rewriting it. So as you can see, credit reports are used for a lot of purposes, not just credit. And a lot of people think of them as some sort of measure of a person's not only financial responsibility, but moral responsibility. And that's not really a fair assessment, because what we know from people who do get in trouble financially aren't able to pay the bills is often it's because of circumstances outside of their control. So it's because they got sick, they lost their job, something happened in their lives. You know, maybe they got COVID or they got laid off because of the pandemic, or someone in their family got COVID and they had to stay home and take care of them. So we know it's often not due to some personality trait, but unfortunately, credit scores and credit reports are often seen that way, and that's why they're used for these non-credit purposes. So there are a whole bunch of problems with using credit reports for non-credit uses, and even when they're used for credit uses, there's a lot of problems with the credit reporting system. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Erika to talk about some of those problems.
So, so before I get into the problems, let me talk a little bit about how I actually receive the problems. I'm going to go back to my practice as a lawyer that focuses on credit reporting issues. There's a law, fortunately, a consumer protection law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And what this does is it regulates a number of the players in this industry. It regulates the consumer reporting agencies, such as the credit bureaus, the Equifaxes, the TransUnions, and it requires them to have on their reports, or it requires them to report information that is maximally possible, that adheres to the maximal possible accuracy standard. So that's a really high standard. Basically, the idea is if you're going to be a company such as a credit bureau reporting this information about consumers, you have to do everything you can to make sure that the information you're actually reporting and selling on to people is maximally possible, is maximal, I always get tongue-tied on it, but meets the maximal possible accuracy standard. It also regulates furnishers. Those are the people who actually, the entities who actually sell this information to the consumer reporting agencies. So that's your student loan provider. That's your credit card holder. Those are the furnishers who give the information to the consumer reporting agencies to begin with. And then it also regulates users. So the people who get these reports and receive them and make decisions about them based on, or to determine your eligibility for employment or insurance or housing or whatnot. The good thing about the FCRA, as with most consumer protection statutes, is that it is fee shifting. So if you've taken a consumer protection class, you know how important that provision is for consumers to be able to enforce their rights under a statute. With a fee shifting statute such as the FCRA, a potential client who's having issues with their credit report can come to me and say, hey, look, you know, I've got this report on my credit, I've got this trade line on my credit report that's completely inaccurate. What do I do? And if there is a case, then I can take that case on a contingency basis so that the consumer can actually have a remedy to try to fix the situation, because most consumers just aren't in the position to pay the enormous attorney's fees out of pocket that it would take to actually file a case under the FCRA. So I think I wanted to kind of put that out there as a backdrop to my practice first, because typically the kinds of problems that I see, the kinds of problems that people come to me with relates to a number of different things. This is where we see the abuses that GT was talking about in the industry. Probably one of the biggest that we see is somebody comes to me and says, hey, look, you know, there's some kind of information on my credit report that just is not mine. Like, it's not ID theft or anything. It's just, this isn't me. To give you an example, maybe if it's a consumer report, there is a conviction on somebody's background report in Pennsylvania. And on the report, it actually has a different name for the person, or a different middle name for the person who was convicted than the name of the report's about. So it's clear if you look at it, like, hey, this isn't even you. Like somehow they just took this and matched it up with you. And that's probably the biggest abuse that we see in the industry, is that a lot of times these consumer reporting agencies get a piece of data and they just match it up with the wrong person because they don't have complete information or whatever. And that happens a lot more than you would think. Sometimes the problem goes even beyond that, where you might have a credit bureau completely mix up two different consumers and think that they're the same person. And that's called a mixed file. And so now you have one person who can almost not escape at all from this other person who Equifax, I'm going to pick on Equifax for a second, thinks that they're the same person. And now you're just intertwined with that person's credit history until you can get it all picked apart. We also see a lot of problems with information that's just outdated. To give you one example, I have a client who was convicted of murder in the 1980s, and the Innocence Project was able to step in recently, and they got him completely exonerated. And the judge in Illinois said, okay, it's been proven you're innocent. Like there wasn't any ambiguity about that whatsoever. The conviction was vacated, and there was actually a declaration that this guy was innocent for the murder that he had been accused of. So he gets out of prison, finally ready to start his life. And what does he do? He tries to he tries to drive for Uber, because that's something that anybody can do, right? Well, Uber runs a background check on him, and wrong. Uber comes back and says, no, you've been convicted of murder. We can't hire you as a driver. So that's an example of one where maybe sometime in the past, that background report was accurate because there was a conviction of murder, but then it just never got updated when something like, I don't know, the judge said, you're innocent. So that we see problems in all sorts of ways, from mismatching information to just not updating information, and all of that oftentimes is a violation of the FCRA, and that's where I can step in to help out the consumer. In the interest of time, I could go on and on and on about my consumer practice, but I'll turn it back to Chi Chi to talk a little bit about some of the bias in the industry.
Thanks, Erika. So I am about to get fancy right now and share my screen. I am hoping this works with this spotlight business. Oh, here goes nothing. All right, are you guys able to see my screen? All right, it worked. I'm even going to get fancier later, so we'll see how far I can push this. So another problem with both the widespread use of credit reports for non-credit uses, as well as even their use in credit, is the racial disparities in credit reporting and credit scoring. As I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and when I began working on credit and consumer reporting issues, I was working on a policy level on the same issues that Erika talked about, the errors and some of the flaws in the procedures used by the credit bureaus that cause these errors. And the fact that it's very difficult to get them fixed sometimes because the whole dispute system is dysfunctional and messed up. But in doing work on credit reporting and credit scoring, one of the things I started seeing was a lot of studies also showing these really glaring racial disparities in credit scores. So you know, for example, the latest one was an analysis of 2016 data from the mortgage giant Freddie Mac. The Urban Institute analyzed this in a report about the Black-white homeownership gap, and found that over 50% of white households had FICO scores above 700, compared to 20% of Black households. 2012 study from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that the median FICO score for a majority minority area was the 34th percentile versus the 52nd percentile for low areas with a low minority population. And I could go on. There are a lot of studies. In fact, all right, let's see if I can advance the power. Oh, sorry. In fact, these studies go back to 1996, and there are about a dozen of them. I have them most of these listed in a policy brief that I did in 2016, which is available on our website called Past Imperfect, if you're curious about this. And the latest study, which is not part of this PowerPoint, is actually from the Urban Institute. They took all this data from the credit bureaus and they mapped it. And if you ever want to be a policy wonk, mapping is your friend. I love mapping. So I am going to try to pull up this website and see if I can. All right, this is not working. Sorry, I was going to try to pull up this website and show you the racial disparities in scoring that the Urban Institute found, and that you can actually go to different geographic areas by state or by county. But I think I probably shared my screen wrong. So what I'm going to do actually maybe is try to do it at the end of the presentation. Sorry, I tried to get too fancy. Okay, so you might be thinking, why are these huge racial disparities in credit scores? And it's not because there's any sort of cultural issue. It's the very things that have been in conversation sort of on a policy level for the past few years, especially you know, after Michael Brown and George Floyd. It's things like the racial wealth gap. Are you guys all familiar with the racial wealth gap? All right, well, just in case folks aren't, there's a lot of research out there showing now that the average Black household has a small fraction of the wealth that a white household has. It's anywhere between 1/8 to 1/10 of the wealth of a white household. And if you think about it, that will have an impact on credit scores, because if you're in a family that has $120,000 worth of wealth, which is the average white family, it's a lot easier to weather periods of financial difficulty than if you only have $10,000 or $12,000 worth of wealth. You know, again, the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates this well. If you get sick or lose your job during the pandemic, it's a lot easier to keep paying bills if you have more wealth. And if you can keep paying your bills, your credit score stays high, your credit report, you know, isn't impaired. And ProPublica did a study about debt collection in different cities that found racial disparities, and their conclusion was the same thing, was the racial wealth gap. Another reason the racial wealth gap may affect credit scores is if you guys are all students, so I bet you know about student loans and how student loans can weigh down someone financially. And obviously it's a lot easier to either avoid student loans or not have to take out as much if you have family wealth than if you don't. And why do we have these wealth gaps? These wealth gaps, of course, are a result of a lot of historical discrimination. Things like redlining, things like the fact that Black consumers and consumers of color were excluded from a lot of social programs during the 30s and 40s such as Social Security. And some of the difference in credit scores is also due to current day discrimination. We know that employment discrimination still exists, housing discrimination still exists, and issues such as, the criminal disparities in criminal justice and over-policing of Black communities, they too have an impact on credit scores. And in fact, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth did a small study of households in Baltimore and found that households where there was a member with a history of incarceration, there was a direct correlation with credit scores. And I don't have the greatest PowerPoint and Excel skills, so if I would have been able to do this properly, I would have cut it off at 500, and you would have seen how dramatic these differences are in credit scores when you have between families with and without a history of incarceration. And again, it makes sense, because if you have a family member who's incarcerated, that's going to have a direct financial impact. First of all, that person isn't able to participate in the labor market. They're not able to earn a wage and bring income into the household. Secondly, one of the unfortunate and difficult parts of the criminal justice system is not only are you talking about a period of incarceration, you're talking about a lot of financial impact, fines, fees, court costs, etc., that also have a direct financial impact. So, and that all shows up in the credit scores. So because of these huge racial disparities in credit scores, the upshot or the impact is it contributes to the continuation and the reinforcement or perpetuation of other gaps. So it makes it harder for Black consumers to get mortgages. That contributes to the gap, home ownership gap between Black and white families. It constrains other access to affordable credit. And getting back to my previous point, the fact that credit reports are used in employment, scores are used in insurance, and reports and scores are used in rental housing means that in each of these areas, it's harder for Black consumers as a group to get ahead, to get jobs, to get affordable insurance, to get decent housing. And just to give you a stark example of this, a couple of years ago, this journal's Climate Wire did a study of disaster loans, and these are loans that are supposed to help consumers that have been impacted by a natural disaster. So they're supposed to be sort of a social purpose loan. And Climate Wire looked at the approval rates and the amount lent in a predominantly white community versus a predominantly Black community, and there was a huge difference. 85% approval for a predominantly white community, Ponte Verde Beach, only about 27% approval in Jacksonville, which is predominantly Black. And Climate Wire, the researcher at Climate Wire concluded this was due to the use of credit scores in SBA disaster loans. And this is important because right now there's a lot of conversation about reparations. And one form of reparations that's being discussed is either down payment assistance or loans for historically excluded communities. And one of the things I've been trying to get across is if you have special programs to assist marginalized communities, if you keep using credit scores, you're not going to achieve your purpose because the credit scores perpetuate the cycle of exclusion. And the way I put it is credit scores are actually a great diagnostic tool. They really show all of this past and present discrimination and historical legacies. They are great at numerically showing how inequality has affected different communities. But then you take that diagnostic tool, and you make it a gatekeeper. And you use it to decide who gets credit and jobs and rental housing. Now you've just perpetuated the very inequality you've diagnosed. And so this is all related to a conversation that's being had in this country about equality versus equity. That if you treat populations that didn't start off in the same place using an equality framework, you're going to just perpetuate inequality, and you need to look at things from an equity framework. So I am going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to try to share the map and get really fancy. So this is a map from the Urban Institute. And it shows nationwide that August of 2020, for example, the share of consumers with a subprime credit score overall in the United States, 22.7% of consumers had a subprime credit score. Subprime usually means 620 FICO score or below, or Vantage score. Sometimes they use Vantage score. White communities, that share was slightly lower, 18.5%. But look at Black communities, 45.8% had a subprime credit score. Native American communities, 47%. Hispanic communities, about 32%. And you can look at the statistics for your own community. So we can do, let's do one nearby, Alameda County, California. You can see in Alameda County that the share of consumers with a subprime credit score is lower than the US average, it's 14.8%, but it's higher for communities of color, 17%, versus only 6% for white communities. And this is just, if you Google Urban Institute credit health during the pandemic, you should be able to find this map. Or I can send links to Professor Merman or Professor Duggan if anybody's interested in that. So I think at this point, we're turning it to questions and answers.
I think that sounds good. And actually, I don't know if I see a number here in the chat. Let me, oh wait, this is from earlier. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure we weren't ignoring anybody. Oops. Sorry. There we go. All right, so yeah, we'll open up the floor now. I know we covered quite a bit of material there, just both in terms of kind of broadly what's going on, and then also just in terms of some of these disparities that we see, but we're happy to answer questions about any of them.
Folks don't have them, I have a list, but.
And feel free to kick us off.
Okay, sure. So I want to invite you to tell us more about that one case, because it's also maybe an eye opener for the students who are interested in practicing in this area. The client who had not inaccurate, but outdated information about the criminal conviction in their history. So what would enable your client meet?
Sure. So that's a good question. I can tell you where we are on it, and I can tell you also some of the limitations on that. So what we did is we filed a class action against the consumer reporting agency that reported that information to Uber. It's a company called Checker. They run all of Uber's background reports. And we alleged that they don't have proper procedures to actually make sure that these criminal convictions are still up to date when they report them. Because, you know, it's not uncommon for convictions to be overturned or vacated for whatever reason or expunged. So, so our position is that these consumer reporting agencies, if they're going to take the time to get the information, then they need to take the time to be able to get the updated information if there is any. That case is still pending. Unfortunately, there's not any resolution to it yet, but I can tell you some of the limitations on it too that we're going to face and that we face with many of these cases is that sometimes this is a game of whack-a-mole. Because, we went after Checker, but what happens when he goes and he applies for that next job somewhere else, and they use a completely different background search company? It could very well pop up again. And a lot of times that is difficult to really drill down on and figure out what the source of that information is. And sometimes if you can figure out if there's one company, for example, like LexisNexis, who's taking that information and selling it onwards, then sometimes you can kind of attack the source, but it can be difficult. It can be difficult to really tamp something like that down. Yes. Okay, so that's a great question. So background checks are going to be under kind of that broader category of consumer reports. They are going to be different than credit reports specifically, and your convictions, any kind of criminal convictions like that, don't typically show up on credit reports. They typically show up on different kinds of consumer reporting products. So they are slightly different, but kind of under the same general consumer report umbrella. Yeah, sure. Yes.
There's an argument made that was like, if we continue to use credit scores, that we're perpetuating some sort of exclusion for access to like jobs and so forth. What would be some ways to help combat those?
Sure. So I would like to hear Chi-Chi's input on that, and I don't know if you were able to hear it, but the question.
No, okay, yeah.
Sure. So the question was related to credit scores, and if they are used to perpetuate inequity, essentially, what can we do about that? Did I phrase it right? Okay.
With respect to non-credit uses, we've basically advocated that credit reports and credit scores should not be used for these non-credit uses. So there are a number of states that, maybe about 11, that restrict the use of credit reports in employment. Those laws tend to have exceptions, and it's really the battles over the exceptions, how broad and how narrow they are. At the federal level, there have been bills introduced to, again, restrict the use of credit reports in employment, maybe having very narrow exceptions for national security or when it's required by law. With respect to tenant screening, we actually have worked with state legislators to introduce a bill to prohibit that, because we think that credit scores actually are not all that predictive if someone's going to pay their rent. Credit scores are designed to predict the likelihood of a 90-day default within 2 years. It's a very specific purpose. What we know is that people tend to pay their rent before other bills. The phrase that's used by Matthew Desmond, who wrote the book Evicted, is the rent eats first. The rent eats first, and it eats first before credit cards. It eats first before, the food, literally. That's why you have the phrase, before medical bills. So our argument is, if you want to look at financial capability to pay rent, you look at income, you look at assets, you don't look at credit reports. And we have seen tenants lose rental housing, not just regular rental housing because of credit reports, but folks who hold housing choice vouchers. These are vouchers where the federal government guarantees a certain amount of payment of rent. So you've got a fairly good guarantee that the rent's going to be received. And yet we've seen renters be rejected, even though they were holding a housing choice voucher based on a credit check. And there's just no reason for it in that case, just none. With respect to credit itself, it's a much more difficult difficult solution, and it's a trickier analysis because, for those of you who've taken any courses on anti-discrimination laws, you'll know that, this would be the use of something that has these significant racial disparities would be judged under a disparate impact analysis. And the second prong of that is whether there's a business necessity or business justification for using a policy or practice with a racial disparity. And in the case of credit scores used for credit, there is a justification because they are also predictive. Here's the fundamental quandary. Credit scores are predictive of how borrowers will perform on a loan. They're bluntly predictive. So, for example, if someone has a subprime score, let's say a 600, it doesn't automatically mean they're not going to be a good borrower. There's like a 20%, 25% chance that they'll default. Now, an 800, someone with an 800 only has like a 4% chance. But that means someone with a 600 credit score, 75% of them will be a performing borrower. So it's very bluntly predictive, but it's predictive enough to provide that business justification. And so trying to deal with it in the credit context really has a lot of thinking about, do you revise the algorithms? How do you make the algorithms less discriminatory or have less racial disparities? Are there other types of data sources that you could use? It's a much more complicated analysis. And I did see a question in the chat about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act being leveraged. So that's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act disparate impact analysis. The other thing to think about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act is it was written using that equality framework. So back in the 1970s, a lot of these anti-discrimination laws were written from this framework of thou shalt not discriminate, which in the 1970s was a big lift. It was a big deal. But now we know thou shalt not discriminate isn't quite good enough for purposes of equity. So, if you're talking about revamping algorithms to be less discriminatory, you might actually have to consider race. Can you do that under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? There is something under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act called a Special Purpose Credit Program, where you can consider race or other protected class status when you're constructing a lending program for marginalized or historically underserved communities. And that's been one thing that's been a lot of conversation about. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Yes.
Did I answer your question in that very long answer?
Is there any consent to use data? And can you use choice as real consent? Just from the European perspective I come from, there's a short comment that it's not allowed for the employee, for instance, to collect some data. So there is the principle of collect as little data as possible. I guess it doesn't apply here.
Right. So I think that's an interesting issue when you think about this from the concept of, or from the perspective of the European side of things, where data is so protected and you have to consent. Actually, Chi-Chi, the question, by the way, was, I'm going to paraphrase, was, what kind of consent is appropriate? Or what kind of consent is necessary here when all of these consumer reporting agencies are collecting this data about you? Because, for example, in Europe, you have to be able to consent, right, in order for companies to collect data. Is that right? And you can withdraw your consent. Exactly. So I think that is an interesting question. And in fact, I'm going to hand that to Chi-Chi too. Do you happen to know much in terms of comparing that to European privacy laws?
So with respect to consumer credit reporting and consumer reporting, the answer is 0. American consumers have all this information collected about them, whether it be in the case of credit reports, regularly monthly updates about how much, whether they've paid their bills on time or how late they are, what their credit limit is, what their balance is. They don't need to consent to that. The American privacy laws with respect to this are relatively weak. The main privacy law that governs financial services is called the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act in general provides a limited opt-out for data sharing, but there's exceptions. Always look at the exceptions. Whenever you look at a statutory scheme, always look at the exceptions. There's exceptions for consumer reporting agencies, for furnishing to consumer reporting agencies. There's exceptions for debt collection, lots of exceptions. Exceptions for use of information by affiliates for marketing. And that has consequences, significant consequences, because a lot of folks have recently said, especially after the big Equifax data breach in 2017, the American consumer has very little control over credit reporting and consumer reporting, and that we as consumers are not the customers of the credit bureaus and other consumer reporting agencies. Our data is the commodity. Or as Stephen Colbert once put it, we're not the customer, we're the chicken. His analogy was like a fried chicken joint. We're the chicken. And that really has affected how credit bureaus and consumer reporting agencies treat consumers. They don't treat us very well. Why? Because we're not the customer. We have no market power. There are 3 credit bureaus, which make it an oligopoly for any of you who've taken antitrust, but it's actually worse than that because you don't have any choice between the 3. It's not like choosing between Comcast and Verizon, right? You have to do all business with all 3. You want a mortgage, you're dealing with Equifax, even though they lost half of Americans' data back in 2017. Now, if you go outside of consumer reporting agencies, there's not great privacy laws. You in California are better off than the rest of the country. There is the California Consumer Privacy Act, and that does give you the right to find out what businesses has collected about you and delete that data, but there's an exception. Always look at the exceptions, and there's an exception for consumer reporting agencies.
Yeah, is that time? Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Susu.
And actually, one last thing
Oh,
before
you
we
need to plug
go.
your class.
Yes, if this was interesting, and I hope it was, be sure to take a look at the credit reporting class coming up this spring here at Berkeley. I'm going to be teaching it. It'll be a 10-week course, 1 hour a week, and I really hope to see some of you there. We're going to cover some of these exciting topics in more depth, as well as some additional stuff. So just wanted to put that out there. Enrollment is coming up. Be thinking about it. And then
Yeah, I was going to hand it over to
So,
Professor Duggan. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got pizza for you in the East Courtyard right here by Cafe Zoud. One more thing is that next week, Tuesday during lunch, for 1Ls, there's going to be a consumer protection law summer job search panel. So that'll be through CAPS, and you should go if you're looking for consumer protection jobs. And thank you all so much for coming. We'll see you out here for pizza. Thank you so much, Chi Chi.
Bye, Chi Chi.
Take care.